Welcome to this APC final assessment mock interview focusing on the quantity surveying and construction pathway. Even though this interview is focused on the QS discipline, all of the mandatory competencies, rules of conduct and ethics are covered, as well as some useful APC interview insights and guidance around interview technique, which I hope everybody finds useful. I don't claim to be an expert in this area, and I'm only speaking from my own experience of the APC interview. Having been through this process myself in 2015 and helped a number of colleagues over the last 5 years, I really want to encourage as many people to work towards becoming a chartered member of the RICS and successfully passing their APC first time. Before we get into the main Q&A session, I just wanted to spend a few moments on trying to dispel some of the common rumours I often hear from candidates who are about to sit their APC final assessment. I hear a lot of candidates say that they feel that APC is a hugely difficult task with an incredibly high fail rate, but I want you to know and understand that this is definitely not the case. Among candidates, there also appears to be a common belief that the interview panel can ask any question and demand that you know the answer in order for you to pass. Again, this is completely inaccurate, so be really conscious not to get daunted by this. To clear up this myth, the actual pass rate of the APC is around 60%, although I think with the right coaching, hard work and organisation, I think in any given study group that can almost be as high as 90% with the right hard work and coaching in place. To touch on the second misconception, I can confirm that you're not expected to know the answer to each and every question, and to add to this, the APC is a period of structured training about how you personally have demonstrated your competence in specific areas, and this means that the APC is personal to you, and the majority of the questioning will be based around your own submission documents. So it's more of a reflection on your own experience excuse me, and telling the assessors what you've done to achieve those competencies in the interview. Before we get into the main Q&A practice, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the structure of the APC final assessment interview. The interview lasts 1 hour and is structured in the following categories or sections. It kicks off with a 3 to 4 minute introduction by the chairperson, where they will ask if you are fit and well to undertake the interview. After this, you'll then be invited to present your own case study in a 10-minute presentation where effectively you have your control of the room and it's your opportunity to make a really good first impression. After the 10-minute presentation of your case study, you'll then be expected to address a number of questions for 5 minutes or so based on your own case study, which at this point you really should know inside out. There is also a technique where you can leave a number of hooks and look to try and tease out specific questions from the assessors that you can be well prepared to answer. Following the case study questioning, you'll then have another 25 minutes of questions from the assessors, focusing on each of the competencies referred to in your submission documents. Following this, there'll then be 10 minutes of questioning from the chairperson with a real focus on the ethics and rules of conduct. A word of warning about this section: you really need to make sure that you know the rules of conduct and ethics inside out, as any failure to answer one of these questions correctly will be an immediate referral. The chairperson will then spend 1 to 2 minutes closing the interview, and this also includes your own opportunity to have the last word and address any questions that you'd like to revisit. You also get a pen and paper in the interview to note down any questions that you couldn't answer first time around. So this is your opportunity to go back and just address any areas that you feel you can build on. The last section then, before we get into the main Q&A practice, is really just touching on some of the interview technique and guidance that I've tried to give some of my colleagues over the last few years to help them through the APC. And I often think that this technique guidance can go overlooked. The first bit of guidance is I often see a lot of candidates fall into the trap of sometimes going off topic and not listening to the specific question that's being asked. So the first bit of advice I would give is to really try and make sure that you listen to the specific question that's being asked and only respond with an answer to that question, and be really conscious to try and avoid going off topic, as you can then invite more questions and get into hot water here with the assessors. So be really conscious to answer the question that's being asked directly. As I've already alluded to, you must answer all of the rules of conduct and ethical questions correctly. Failure to do so will result in a referral. It's also okay not to know the answer to a few questions. So in your response, if you're ever not sure about something, I'd advise really not to take a chance, and you can always just say to anything you're not sure of that you'd look to try and review that with a colleague, or you'd refer to the RICS guidance note, relevant RICS guidance note, or you can get advice from a senior colleague in your firm. So there are ways to avoid answering questions that you're not too sure of, although be really conscious not to do that too often. You could probably get away with doing that 2 or 3 times. That said, if they're asking you something that's clearly listed in your submission document, then on that area you probably really are going to be expected to know the answer to that question. In your responses, also be sure to be really confident and concise. Try to avoid using any hypothetical language such as I believe or I think. The assessors really want to make sure that you are operating at a fairly intermediate level, and that you're confident in what your advice is to your clients. So be really careful to avoid any hypothetical language. In particular, on the level 2 type questions where it's reflecting on your own experience, be sure to try and talk in a really positive, definitive way in the past tense about the things that you actually did. Without further ado, let's get into the main interview question and answer practice. As I say, this is focused on the quantity surveying and construction pathway, although to start off it does contain and cover a lot of the mandatory competencies. So I really hope you find this of use, regardless of which pathway you're on, even if you're not from a QS background. So as we start the Q&A practice, obviously you'll be expected to deliver your 10-minute presentation on your case study, which in this case we won't do. We'll just assume that that's already been undertaken. And we'll now go into 5 minutes of presentation-related questions surrounding the case study. So the first potential question you could be asked would be, can you tell the assessors how you demonstrated 2 of the 5 global professional and ethical standards within your case study project? Some of the answers that you could give to this kind of question are 5-fold. So obviously there are 5 different global professional and ethical standards. The first being to act with integrity, to always provide a high standard of service, act in a way that promotes trust in the profession, treat others with respect, and take responsibility. So I really think it's worth taking 15-20 minutes going through and looking into what each one of these means. Certainly, acting with integrity, you could give an example in your case study. For example, you may have brought a contractor's attention to an error within a tender document, or had to decline work due to a conflict of interest. So it's really just about demonstrating how you've tried to demonstrate real integrity and doing the right thing. Always provide a high standard of service. So try to think of an example how you've gone above and beyond to meet a client's needs and expectations. Acting in a way that promotes trust in the profession could be an example where you've really demonstrated a lot of trust and honesty, and you've really asked yourself the question, how your actions, if they were to be brought into a public domain, would you be proud of those actions to be portrayed in things like the media or a well-known forum? Always be sure to treat others with respect and being professional and courteous at all times. So you could reflect on an example there. and taking responsibility. For example, have you walked around site, undertaken an evaluation or an inspection, and seen practices that aren't to your sort of standards of health and safety on site, and watching out for others. So you might have gone above and beyond there to take responsibility for your own health and safety and that of others. So these are just a few examples of how you could potentially look to address that question. The next question then is, when presenting your case study, you mentioned that you prepared a pre-tender estimate. Could you just tell me what assumptions and exclusions you've made as part of that estimate? So some of the things that you might look to exclude or assume within a pre-tender estimate could be the provision around asbestos removal. Is that included or excluded? The specifications, drawings and scheme information are normally clearly referenced. Caveats should be included on the amount of project contingency being recommended. The position on construction and tender inflation would also really be clarified in a pre-tender estimate. VAT is normally excluded, and a follow-on question that you could potentially get from the assessor on that is why. So obviously different organisations pay VAT at different levels, and that's normally why we'd look to exclude VAT from a client's pre-tender estimate. The next question we'll focus on is obviously preparing some financial reports for a client, and typically what they normally contain. And to address that question, typically financial reports would reference any provisional sum movement and updates. They would clarify the remaining amount of project contingency. They would have a reference to the original contract sum plus any agreed and anticipated variations. Typically also look to try and include an anticipated total forecast cost or overall running final account, a cash flow forecast, and potentially a project risk register. So these are just some of the examples that you could touch on in addressing what a typical financial report or financial statement would contain for a client. Okay, so this next question is focusing on some of the terminology that I've referenced in the case study. So again, we've said that we've included provisional sums on our case study project, and the assessors are now looking to try and interpret our knowledge of defined versus undefined provisional sums. So the defined provisional sum are those that are sufficiently well defined or detailed to allow the contractor to make allowances in their tender for programming, planning and pricing any preliminaries. There will be sufficient design information to describe how the works items in question are to be fixed to the building, in which location and in what quantity. The next question is, could a contractor claim additional preliminary costs resulting from the expenditure of a defined provisional sum? So the answer to this is obviously no. So there would not be a valid claim due to the provisional sum being defined, and on the inclusion of that, all main contractor prelims costs are deemed included within the original contract sum. Okay, so now let's get on to some mandatory competency questions. First of all, we'll take a look at accounting principles and procedures. What are the key financial statements that all companies must provide / what are company accounts? The key financial statements to be provided by companies are profit and loss accounts, balance sheets, and cash flow forecasts or cash flow statements. The next question is, when have you used company accounts in your work, or when do you think you may need to in the future? So a level 2 question here, so hopefully you have got an example of where you can reflect on your own experience in doing this. So typically we'd look to use financial company accounts to assess the financial strength of contractors at PQQ and tender stages. The next question in relation to this is, why do you analyse company accounts? And this is to assess a company's financial performance over a period of time against other similar companies. It's also to verify the solvency and financial suitability of potential tenderers for a project to make sure that they're on a good financial footing before entering into a contract with that particular contractor. Okay, so the next slides will focus on the business planning mandatory competency. The first question in this section are, what are your firm's terms of business? So obviously this will relate to your own company's or firm's terms of business, so I really think it's worth printing these off just to get a good appreciation of what these consist of. So typically within a letter of engagement, the T's and C's will form the contract between our firm and the client, and the terms of business typically contain the following. So it's your own firm's general obligations to provide services detailed in the engagement letter with the skill, care and diligence expected of a professional person. Our liability, so claims against any particular firm, and the liability stretches out to the firm in question and not any particular partner or employee. So it's the overall firm or your company who takes the overall liability of any claims. Remuneration, so any late payments are to be treated in accordance with the Late Payment of Commercial Debts or Interest Act, and this will clearly set out the amount of interest that's to be paid on any late payments. There are the termination or suspension terms, so minimum of 7 days notice to suspend the works. The second question we'll touch on is, what is a SWOT analysis? So very concisely you can just say that this is determining the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of an organisation. So it's very concise answer that you can give there. The next competency we'll take a look at is that of client care. First question in this competency that we'll take a look at is, when should you decline an instruction of work for a client? The answers you could potentially give to this is if there is a conflict of interest, so if you're going to engage for that client and potentially you could be working for a competitor, or you may have somebody else undertaking work for that particular client that's going to potentially cause issues, and you may need to decline an instruction or new work because of that. If it's not in the client's interest, so for example if you're under-resourced or you're very busy at a particular time and you can't resource the job, if the work that the client is proposing is illegal, then you must always decline those sort of invitations from a client. The next question we'll take a look at is to provide an overview of the principles of client care. So typically under client care, we're looking to identify clients, both existing and new, to maintain working relationships and bring in new work. Understanding different types of clients and genres and understanding their general objectives and interests. Making reference to the RICS Code of Conduct when building and maintaining relationships. Having a robust complaints handling procedure that's in line with the own RICS guidance note and procedures. Collecting and responding to client feedback on a regular basis to address any issues. And that should give a good response to that particular question on client care. The next competency we'll take a look at is health and safety. Okay, so what would you find in the health and safety file? The answer to this is that it needs to contain health and safety information that will be useful for the planning of future works or maintenance. The construction plan, building manual and contract documents are not useful here. A brief description of the work that's to be carried out. Any residual hazards which remain and how they have been dealt with, for example surveys or other information concerning asbestos, contaminated land, water-bearing strata or buried services. Key structural principles, for example bracing, sources of substantial stored energy, including pre or post-tension members, and safe working loads of floors, roofs, particularly where these may preclude placing scaffolding or heavy machinery there. Hazardous materials that are on the site, for example, lead or paint, any pesticides, special coatings. Then the next question on health and safety is whether the candidate is aware of any RICS guidance notes on health and safety. So the best answer you can give on this is to refer to your knowledge of the RICS guide to surveying safely. You then may get a follow-up question just on your knowledge of this document, and you will be expected to refer to some of the sections within this document. So this contains sections on things, for example, such as lone working. How would a potential rescue be achieved in the event of an accident? How others would be aware of any lone working that's been undertaken, so whether you have a check-in, check-out policy or a contact number policy, or things such as updating your calendar so other people know your whereabouts on any particular day if you're attending site. Procedures for keeping in contact, travelling to and from site, condition of the property that you're inspecting, site-specific risks, and this is the cover of the said document, so it's really worth printing off a copy of this and just getting an appreciation of the different sections that it contains, so you can look to try and address this if you do get asked a question on the RICS guide to surveying safely. Okay, so we'll now focus on some sustainability questions. Okay, so first off, level 1 question. What is sustainability? This is the ability to meet our own needs without affecting the ability of future generations to meet the needs of their own. It involves a combination of environmental, social and economic considerations. You then may get asked a follow-up question in terms of how this is relevant to your own discipline. So for quantity surveyors in particular, there is now legislation in place such as the carbon zero target by 2016, so you need to make sure you take into account future costs in any potential estimates there. There's the Energy Act in 2011, which makes it illegal to lease a building with a energy performance certificate or rating below E by 2018. Again, you need to make this take this into account when pricing any refurbishment projects. You also need to make sure that our clients have allocated a realistic portion of their budget to comply with sustainability requirements, whether that's SCAR ratings or BREEAM. One of the biggest challenges is to demonstrate the financial benefit of sustainable solutions to clients. We'll now focus on the data management competency. So again, this question really applies to your own specific experience. So again, it's a level 2 question. So what web tools do you use to manage data? And this really does depend on your own firm. I think at this point it's really good to reflect on what your firm does and reference some software packages that you use to manage clients' data. So this could be Business Collaborator, Google Docs or Dropbox. It should provide a member of the project's organisation access to view all the relevant project documents, and it should also be secure and ensure full privacy and protection of data in line with the latest GDPR requirements. Okay, so the next question is a really hot topic at the moment. Obviously, this legislation has recently been introduced in the last couple of years, and this is how businesses are to remain compliant with GDPR. There's a lot of information available on this online, so again, I'd really recommend reading up on this area as a potential hot topic. And a lot of the GDPR regulations request that businesses raise awareness internally within the business about protecting data, audit all personal data, update any privacy notices, review procedures and supporting individuals' rights, review procedures supporting subject access requests, identify documents your legal basis for processing personal data. Okay, so we'll now get into some of the core QS competencies. First off, looking at contract practice. Okay, so first off, we'll start with a level 1 question, and this is: what 8 conditions need to be met for a contract to be in place? These consist of, first off, an offer by one party, for example a tender, acceptance by the other party, consideration, so that is a sum of money that's passed between both parties, the intention to form the contract, for example lending money to a friend is a favour, not a contract, legality of contract, so nothing should be prohibited by law, the contract should be fully lawful, the capacity to make agreement, so this should exclude any minors or anybody suffering with mental capacity or mental difficulty issues. There also must be consent, so there must be meeting of minds, not use force or influence on vulnerable people. It must be fully consensual to enter into the contract. Possibility of performance. So what are the advantages of standard forms over bespoke contracts? Some of the examples you could give to address this question are that the standard forms are written by legal experts. Rights and obligations of each party are clearly set out to the required level of detail. Risks should have been allocated evenly between the parties. Parties should be familiar with the provision in the forms. So for example, if you're used to using a JCT or NEC contract regularly, then it will help administer things during the post-contract stages. There should be fewer unforeseen anomalies. The time and expense of preparing a new contract document is obviously much cheaper, and you don't have to get expensive legal teams involved to incorporate any schedule of amendments. Case law is built up over time, so it provides a good source of knowledge and clarity of the terms that are being entered into. So when pricing an extension of time, what would you include for, and what rates would this be based on? So to address this question, when pricing an extension of time, you would normally look to include costs for prolongation of prelims, so things like site cabins, site utilities and welfare. Facilities management staff, security, cleaners, and inefficient use of labour and plant resources would also be priced in an extension of time. Subcontractor mobilisation costs, head office, finance charges and loss of profit would also be included. Okay, so let's now move on to project financial control and cost reporting. So next question is on financial reports. So what would you typically look to include in a financial report for a client? This would include reference to the contract sum, any instructed variations, potential future variations such as advance warnings, any ongoing claims, the anticipated final account total, the total of certified payments. Then the next question in relation to financial reports is: what is the purpose of a financial report? So this is to report against the budgeted values and act as a working cost check on the project budget. It's also there to give the client an understanding of any savings or additional monies that are required. It can also be used to report on contract progress against pre-contract predictions. Okay, so another very basic level 1 type question. So what are variations? So these form alterations or modifications to the design, quality or quantity of the contract works. This could be to the site access or working conditions, and these typically arise due to change of specifications or discrepancy between contract documents, discrepancy with statutory requirements, errors and omissions, and the deficiency in employer's requirements. So if these aren't fully detailed, this could result in a variation being raised. Okay, so the next question is slightly more advanced. So this is, how would you assess an adverse weather claim for an extension of time? So if this is something that you've received and you can reflect on your own experience, then that's really good, and you can reflect on that to look to try and address this question. So some of the things that you would assess would include, it would need to be supported by historical weather data, taking into account the time of year and the region the project in question is located in. The contractor's claim should be based on data from a recognised independent source, such as the Met Office, and the rainfall and temperatures referenced would be compared against previous years to determine if these would adversely affect the impact on the progress of the project. And also you've got to assess, is the adverse weather that's being claimed for a particular period, is that equivalent to the extension of time being sought by the contractor? We'll now move on to the quantification and costing of construction works competency. Okay, so what are the key differences between standard method of measurement and the new rules of measurement? One of the key differences is that the elements are broken down further within NRM2, with 41 work sections against the 22 trade sections in SMM7. Many small items deemed to be included within the rates, so these had previously been priced separately within SMM7, and this was regarded as being a uneconomical use of a surveyor's time. There are clearer definitions of prime costs and provisional works and allowances for risks. The next section we'll look at is the definition of a prime cost sum. So a prime cost sum is a cost of an item that has either been not selected or priced at the time of tender. If the price of the item chosen is greater than the PC sum, then the client will pay the builder any difference plus profit for that said item. So this is typically used for things like brickwork, which are not always typically known at the price of tender. So you could include a prime cost sum for a set quantity of bricks. So this is more referring to the RICS Code of Measuring Practice. So what is GEA? This obviously stands for Gross External Area. A follow-on question might be, what does this area include? And this is the area of the building measured externally at each floor level. A related question to this as well is, what is GIA? So this is the gross internal area, and this is made up of the building measured to the internal face of the perimeter walls at each floor level. As I've already alluded to, whereabouts would these acronyms be defined? These are defined in the Code of Measuring Practice published by the RICS. The next question is, how would you look to measure cut and fill? This could be done by CAD measure. If this piece of software is not available, we could then look to obtain the project drawings with existing and proposed levels. This could then be divided into the area of the excavation and split up into a grid. We would then look to interpret the levels of each grid to establish the average of the existing and proposed levels, which would determine the overall cut and fill quantity. Okay, so we'll now take a look at conflict avoidance and dispute resolution. So within this competency area, we'll take a look at what are some of the key steps when preparing for a negotiation. There are 3 stages leading up to a negotiation. So a claim will typically have been received or notified by the contractor, setting out what items need to be negotiated, who is involved, and any supporting substantiation in relation to those items. There'll be an initial response and planning, so what the current stance is, any bargaining positions, aims and strategy would be really discussed internally between yourself and potentially your clients and colleagues prior to the meeting. When preparing to meet, there'd obviously be an undertaking of detailed planning, negotiation team selection and role definition. There would be the negotiation meeting itself. Let's now take a look at a communication competency related question. So a very general question that could come up in this competency is, what do you think about email communication? A typical answer for this could be that an email has the same legal value as a letter, and contracts can invariably be created by email unintentionally. We must therefore be very careful on the content and form of email communication. This can often be fairly relaxed, although legally they can form a formal legal contract, so they do need to be taken with care. You must always communicate in a professional manner, even if other parties don't, which again really ties into the global professional and ethical standards and always treating others with respect. Also make sure that you select the correct recipient and do not show other people's email addresses without their own consent, which again really ties into the latest GDPR regulations. Let's now look at the final competency area, which is really probably one of the most important sections, and as I already alluded to, any failure to answer these questions correctly would result in an immediate referral. So you really do need to know the rules of conduct and ethical standards inside and out. The first question we'll take a look at are, what are the RICS 5 principles of better regulation? So these all focus on how the RICS is self-regulated. These are made up of proportionality, accountability, consistency, targeting, and transparency. And again, I'd really recommend just doing a quick Google search for these and printing off the copies so you can gain a really good understanding of what each of the 5 principles of better regulation mean in practice. How many professional and ethical standards are there? So again, we've already covered these, so there are 5 global professional and ethical standards in total, and you will be expected to know and be able to recall these within the final assessment interview if requested. A follow-on question to this is, why does the RICS have particular rules of conduct? These provide a framework that everybody can work to, so clients know the level of service they can expect. As well as being an important tool for the institution, the rules of conduct are also a useful professional guide for individual institution members. The next follow-on question to this is, how many rules of conduct for members are there? And can you recall these? So again, you really will be expected to be able to recall these in a final assessment interview. So there are 9 rules of conduct for members altogether. These are made up of interpretation, communication, ethical behaviour, competence, service, continuous professional development, solvency, information to the RICS, and cooperation. And again, I really think it's worth doing a quick Google search for this and gaining a good understanding of what each rules of conduct means in practice for its members. So this is a commonly asked question. So what procedures must you follow in starting up a new practice? So first off, you would generally look to contact the RICS for guidance. They could provide a company startup pack. You must inform the RICS and register for regulation. You must appoint a contact officer for all RICS communication. You should have a very robust complaints handling procedure that's in accordance with RIC's rules of conduct. You must obtain professional indemnity insurance cover. You must also abide by the rules of conduct for firms. Use of the regulated RICS and logo in all practice material. The next question, again in relation to this, is which insurances you would need to have in place before starting up your own firm. This is professional indemnity insurance, employer's liability insurance, public liability insurance, building insurance of your own office. Okay, so again, another very common question is, what must a complaints handling procedure include? So to address this, the RICS provides a model form that all members and firms must comply with. This must include a redress mechanism. Details should be issued to the client within your firm's term of business. It must be clear, quick, transparent, impartial and free of charge. Names and contact details of the nominated investigating person must be clearly stated. The complaint must be investigated within 28 days. All complaints, their progress and outcomes must be recorded. There's also the need to advise professional indemnity insurers of any complaint as quickly as possible. The complaints procedure must have 2 stages as a minimum. So this should include consideration of the complaint by a senior member of the firm or the complaints handling officer. If not resolved, this should then include the second stage, whereby the complaint is referred to an independent third party with the authority to award redress. That brings us to the end of the Q&A. I really hope everybody has found this video useful, and please check the link in the description for more useful APC resources. Thank you.